Swimming like a shark in a shrimp tank. Big fish, small pond in the shrimp tank.
Welcome back to another episode of the Shrimp Tank, coming to you virtually from Seattle and the entire Pacific Northwest. We are thankful that you're here. Listen, if you want to learn how to start, grow, or run a successful business, this right here is the podcast for you. We like to call it the podcast of record. This is where street smarts and book smarts collide. Hello again, everyone. I'm Dan Whedon. I have a special co-host today. It's our intrepid producer, and sometimes she substitutes as my wife. Actually, she does it all the time. Barb Whedon, making her debut today. We'll talk to Barb more about that. Our guest today, we're excited to have Jake Bernstein from K&L Gates. Jake is an expert and a thought leader when it comes to cyber legal liability for businesses. Jake is an internet-focused lawyer with a passion for technology, privacy, and security issues. As a former government regulator, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that, he uses his experience to assess privacy data security risks and develop business-friendly strategies to reduce and manage related legal risks. Jake also hosts his own podcast with former Shrimp Tank podcast guest Kip Boyle. I've been a guest on that show. Jake, welcome to the show. We'll be with you in just a minute. Everybody, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts: iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, YouTube. You might say we are ubiquitous. We come to you from about a dozen cities, including the mothership in Atlanta, Boston, Boca Raton, Charleston, Knoxville, Columbus. We are new in Dallas as well. Now, but listen, before we bring on Jake, Barb, welcome to the show.
I am glad to be here. Thank you.
Everybody here knows your voice because you've been behind the curtain as our producer. But I will have to let everybody know James Alberson, who had been one of our co-hosts for quite a long time, between his Renton City Council gig and a client issue that comes up at this time, had to back away. Linda Popke stepped in a couple weeks, and this time I couldn't get any of the other co-hosts. So Barb, thanks for stepping in. Are you excited?
You're well. Yes, I am. And thank you. And, we wish James all the best.
Well, you might. I don't know if I do. He left us high and dry. No, James is a great guy, and we do wish him the best. And again, thanks for stepping up from behind the curtain and helping us with my good friend Jake Bernstein. Jake, first of all, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you. And as I mentioned with Barb just a couple times, as a producer, she kind of was like the great Oz, right behind the curtain, and she's stepping out. We know, all of us by now know, that the people really hiding behind the curtains are all of the cyber criminals. Gone are the days of wearing a mask into a bank. Oh, wait a minute. Never mind. We still are wearing masks into banks, but gone are the days of holding up banks. People are holding us up and doing crazy things from behind the curtain, which causes a lot of problems. I'd like to ask you, before we dive into those, how in the heck did you get into this business of cyber liability law?
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me on the podcast today. It's you kept saying behind the curtain, and all I could think about was, kind of behind the Iron Curtain in a way. At least
that's right.
Trying to get back there. But how I got into this. So, as you hinted at, I come from a regulatory background. I used to work at the Attorney General's office for the state of Washington, where I was a assistant attorney general in the Consumer Protection Division. And, that meant that I was doing a lot of high-tech related kind of scam prosecutions, anti-fraud work. And it didn't take all that long until I started to get cases that I would now consider to be kind of privacy and cybersecurity. So it really started, way back in 2012, 2013 or so, when I started to see cases that really took shape, in the cybersecurity area. And then frankly, it's fascinating. I was invited to a Secure World Expo, and I went, and the keynote was very interesting. I'll never forget how a former CIA employee, mentioned that the Russians had code in our traffic lights, and keep in mind that was 2014 that we were talking about this, and I was kind of hooked. So when it was time to go into private practice, I decided that I was going to be a cybersecurity lawyer, and I've kind of made it up as I've gone, and it's really turning into a pretty good practice area.
So as you have built this practice since 2012, did you say 2014?
So I went into private practice in 2015. So I would have to say that I started building the practice for real in 2015.
Obviously, things have changed even in that 6 years or 7 years.
Yeah.
And are you seeing the growth in this area, anytime tapering off, or is this going to continue for the next 10, 20 years?
Oh, I think it's going to continue for the next 50 years. Potentially even longer. And it's not going anywhere. If anything, it's getting more and more serious. The world is a more dangerous place than it was even 7 years ago. And that's just as true online as we're seeing it, in the real world. So I think the growth here is going to stay pretty high for quite a while.
So, Jake, as you know, and when I was on your podcast, we talked quite a bit about this. I work with small and medium-sized companies with cyber insurance. It's one of the areas that we talk about. And of course, when it comes to business continuity, cyber is near the top. However, there's a lot of discussion when we talk about it around the methodology of cyber, like a lot of things that Kip Boyle will talk about. I think sometimes what gets lost, at least in the minds of some of these owners, is the actual legal liability part. We worry about ransomware. We worry about damage to our computers. We worry about things like that. But sometimes I think we forget about the legal liability aspect. Can you do kind of a summary of some of the real legal concerns that small and medium-sized business owners should be worried about?
Yeah. So, the cost of a data breach is, there's a lot of different studies. You can find lots of different numbers. We'll just say that it is high. But when you get down to the legal liability, there's a couple of places that you can look. The most concrete number I can give right now is $750. $750 per record, essentially, is the statutory damage under the California Consumer Privacy Act. And the reason that's important is that, most privacy laws at this point aren't really allowing for private causes of action, which means you're not going to get a class action plaintiff lawyer coming after you. The CCPA, though, is the massive elephant in the room that is really driving a lot of adoption and I think concern about not just the CCPA, but many other privacy laws that are being looked at around the country. And you think about it this way. If the statutory damages are $750 per record, it doesn't take many records of personal information to get just astronomically high potential damages. And even though a court isn't necessarily going to award the maximum $750 per record, you just do the math, right? 1,000 records is still $750,000.
Well, and Jake, yeah, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to kind of highlight this because that 1,000 records on a cyber insurance liability is on an application. Usually the question is, how many records do you have? And it starts out less than 1,000. So 1,000 is considered to be really the low end of that.
Exactly.
But the low end, and again, they might not get the whole thing, but it's a foundational way to say, hey, this is potentially anywhere from a quarter, $750,000 to $1 million if you're somewhere around 1,000 records that you keep.
Exactly. And the numbers just go up from there. And besides, as you said, who has 1,000 records? Almost nobody, right? That's a tiny amount of information to have on your customers. And so, and that's just California, right?
Yeah.
There's other states where class action lawyers are bringing suits all the time. It's not as easy to bring a lawsuit elsewhere because of there's all this, and we don't have to get into detail on that, but suffice to say, there's a lot of detail around harm and whether there's standing and all these legal concepts, and the liability is less clear. However, what is clear is that whether you're found liable or not, you're still going to be spending a lot of money to defend those cases, and to the point where you may decide to settle even if liability is unclear. So I don't want to lose sight of that, is that just because the liability isn't clear doesn't mean that there's no expense related to it. I mean, you still have to defend. It's going to be very expensive. And that doesn't even mention, that's just kind of the kind of plaintiff style court issue. There's also the expense of giving notification under the various, data breach notification laws that are around the country. Every single state plus DC has a notification law. And, let's do some more simple math. Even if you don't, even if there's no penalties involved because you're doing it, right? Let's just say that you have to print and mail a letter to 100,000 customers, right? Postage alone, right, is starting, it's maybe bulk rates, 20 cents a letter? I don't even know, 30 cents a letter. That's still like $20,000 just in postage. Not to mention the time and the hassle of all that stuff. So data breaches are really expensive. Failing to comply with the notification obligations can get very expensive if an AG decides to investigate you. Some states are more aggressive about that than others. And then of course you're paying lawyers to figure out what your obligations are, which is yet another expense. So
Jake, I want to kind of change the subject just a little. Did I see on your bio that you are did a cellular and molecular biology? How did you get into being an attorney for cyber?
Well, that sure is a flip of the subject. My growing up, I believe I really only ever wanted to do, I think, really two things. It was I was going to be a marine biologist for years and years until I got on an ocean-going boat and felt sick to my stomach and realized maybe this is not the best profession for me. I like sharks, I like animals, I like the ocean, but boats, not so much. And after that, then at some point I learned about genetics. And so, through high school, even I was like, oh, I'm going to go, get a PhD in genetics. And I followed that almost all the way through to my senior year of college. When it came time to actually apply to PhD programs, I realized I don't love this enough. Doing bench science, using a micropipette to take little tiny bits of liquid from one vial and putting them into little tiny bits of liquid in another vial. It's exciting, but the reality of science let's just say I felt that if you didn't have a passion for it, it might not be the best thing to do. And I'd always loved to argue. I'd always had a head for rules. And at the time, my thinking was, I'm really concerned about judges without any scientific knowledge or experience making law, because I knew enough about the law at that point to kind of vaguely understand that who the judge is and their own knowledge does matter. And so that was the transition period was, I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to become a judge. And that way I will at least be a judge who knows science. Now, that doesn't answer the whole question because obviously I'm not a judge. What can I say? I didn't really know what I was talking about to myself back then when I went to law school. It turned out being a judge is really very different than I thought. And you have to basically be a trial lawyer. Didn't really want to be a trial lawyer or a prosecutor. So I ended up, like I said, in consumer protection, and that was a much more natural flow into cybersecurity.
Well, Jake, just it seems like about everybody else, it's not linear, is it? The whole path
No,
of career is certainly not a linear one.
no.
So what else isn't linear, I guess sometimes is our show. We have to take a break. We have to take a dip right now to pay the bills. And we're going to take that short break to hear from today's spotlight sponsor. And when we come back with our guest, Jake Bernstein, for our hot or not section of the show, we're going to find out if Alexa is hot or not. Don't walk away. We will be back with more of the Shrimp Tank. And today I get to do my own commercial because I got her working. And so I'm going to do a real quick commercial for First Underwriters Insurance, of which Barb and I are both affiliated with. We're spending a lot of time today talking about cyber liability, security, and all of that. Well, if you don't want to have to pay those bills, I mean, we were talking about $750,000, $1 million, maybe $2 million. If you don't want to have to pay those bills and you're forced to through the consequences of some cyber calamity, you need cyber insurance. And that's one of the areas that we at First Underwriters specialize in. So if after listening to Jake talk and he's scared you sufficiently and you don't have cyber insurance, or you do and you'd like to take get a second opinion, please contact me, Dan Whedon, at 360-271-1592. You can also go to dan@danwhedon.com, and I'd be happy to spend some time talking to you about cyber insurance. With that, Barb, I'm going to turn it back to you to pull us out of commercial break.
Right. Welcome back to the Shrimp Tank, where we interview the brightest and best CEOs and business thought leaders in the greater Puget Sound area and beyond. I'm Barb Whedon, and our guest today is Jake Bernstein. Now for our next segment, Hot or Not.
So, Jake, this is where Barb and I are going to pepper you with some questions about business, about life, about cyber, probably not too much microbiology or anything like that, but you never know what boat we throw out there. But I mentioned Alexa, and everybody knows who Alexa is now because she is sometimes ubiquitous in homes. Hot or not, can Alexa, what you say to Alexa can be used against you in a court of law?
That is an interesting question. Are you asking if the recordings on Alexa can be used in a court of law, or if they can?
I tried to make that a hot or not. It didn't work. How about I just ask
No,
you
that
this,
didn't
Jake?
work. That's a really complicated question, Dan.
I know. How about
And
this?
I've got to.
Alexa is obviously, in the cloud. I mean, I don't know how the technology works, but is something that is either transmitted because you have Alexa or something you say is using Alexa, could that actually cause you legal liability?
Oh, Dan, I think it depends. Yeah, you're asking a lawyer a hot or not. That's binary. We don't operate in a binary world. I guess I would have to say hot, maybe. It could. It depends. I mean, we have seen cases where prosecutors have been able to subpoena evidence from Alexa, the cloud, in order to investigate a crime. Was that against the person's interest? I mean, not necessarily. It could be used to find evidence to try to find a kidnapping victim, right? If Alexa happened to record that, I guess the point here is that it is a live microphone, right? I mean, in order for any of these technologies to work, they are technically always listening, right? Now, they may not activate unless you say the magic word, of which there are several of which I will not say because I have one and it will activate. But still, they are technically, listening in that sense. And so, I don't know. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to figure out over time.
Well, let me ask you this, if you don't, Bart, I just have a quick follow-up. Can cyber criminals access information by hacking into an Alexa? Is that a route?
I would doubt it.
Okay.
Just because there's so many layers between one of those devices and your information.
Okay.
I mean, really, it itself is just a speaker with some, networking components and a microphone built in. All the magic is going to happen in the cloud, and so I think that would be challenging.
Okay.
Instead of a hot or not, how about a true or false? And maybe that'll be a little easier. Are employers, are they responsible for their employees when they are at work on the computer and what they do on the internet? Are the employers responsible? True or false? Or the employers are responsible?
Yeah, generally true. I mean, and this because most employers have very clear, acceptable use policies, internet usage policies about what you are supposed to do and not supposed to do. The concept of liability there, it is so variable. I mean, certainly if an employee goes someplace on the internet and gets infected, like, with ransomware, then yeah, I mean, obviously the employer is going to feel the effects of that. If an employer goes online, posts something offensive or defamatory, that's a different situation entirely.
So let's talk virtual employees, because obviously over the last about 24 months, virtual employees have become not just a thing, but a major thing. And so you may have employees working from home on their own personal computers, accessing information that may or may not be in the company's network, but working on company time. Should employers be concerned about those virtual workers who might be more susceptible to a crime being committed against them on a cyber basis? What are some of the legal ramifications there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to reword your question to, how does cyber liability for remote workers play out?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is it's a huge problem, because ultimately, the company has to secure its remote work systems, and if they're not secure, then that is what's going to allow some kind of end user or endpoint attack on a remote worker's machine that could then lead back to the corporate network. And in that situation, yeah, that's just the vector. I mean, the liability isn't going to change, as we mentioned earlier. And then there's a separate question of employee liability, and I think even that is up in the air at this point.
So if we look at what's happening in the world right now, and I know this is not hot or not, but what do you see in the future, in the near future, with what is happening in Russia and the Ukraine? How do you see that impacting cyber legal liability?
So this is a really interesting situation. Obviously tragic for the people of Ukraine. But in terms of, and Dan, you'd probably be well aware of the force majeure clause oftentimes will include a war exception, right? So let's just say, well, we don't have to say, we know that Russia is using cyber weapons in their assault on Ukraine, and it's already happened where one of their cyber weapons from years ago, the NotPetya worm, caused damage, collateral damage to unintended targets. And, there have been cases where those, the question was, well, particularly on the insurance side, is this an act of war and does it fall under the war exclusion or not? And that gets very, very sticky. I think it's going to change a lot of contract language. I think people are going to want to find insurance that will cover them if it's an act of war like this, because that's not really what the act of war exclusions were meant to cover. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting area of development.
Well, without getting too geeky on this and people just shutting us off, let's talk a little bit about insurance and law together, because you bring up an excellent point. Every insurance contract has a war exclusion. However, most have at some level a terrorism coverage. So now are we splitting? Where are we splitting hairs? Is it terrorism? Is it war? What does it mean? And when you start talking about things like drones and other technology-based things that have a cyber component, I'm in agreement with you. And I don't know if there's a question there, but maybe just a comment from you. This is a highly volatile, uncertain time, not only for the legal aspect, for the insurance aspect, and somebody might be saying, well, why do we care? Well, we might care because you might as well be sitting next door. You could be anywhere in the world. And if something happens against our country that Russia says, well, we're going to attack you with cyber, we're talking about small and medium-sized businesses maybe able not to even get on and work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is not, as you kind of mentioned at the beginning, we've moved away from the robbers don't need to go into the banks anymore. And, physical proximity is largely irrelevant in the cyberspace, right? And I think, even I just realized what I said. I said the cyberspace because I was thinking, but really that's why we call it cyberspace. Like it's different from the meat space, if you will, the real world. And so, yeah, it really that's exactly right. I mean, you don't have to be anywhere near anywhere near any conflict zone. Because let's be honest, every future conflict is going to involve a cyber component.
I mean, I know that in the insurance industry, and I'm sure it's similar in the legal, it comes down to definitions. It comes down to an understanding of what is terrorism and what is war. And we saw that, was it last year, at Christmas when the bomb exploded, was it Nashville? And, there were business owners waiting months afterwards because the federal government was going back and forth if it was terrorism or not. And, would that come under their policy? So I would imagine that as this, the definitions are being defined as we go. Is that correct?
They are. And the tricky thing about insurance and the interpretation of insurance, it is a legal issue. I mean, you can't separate the two, right? And that's the argument. There's a lot of litigation coverage disputes all the time. And but if you think about, the difficulty here is that you also you kind of want to know what your insurance covers before you decide to pay for it. And so right now, the situation is really not great for either insurance companies or brokers or buyers of policies, because there's these things that are happening that haven't happened before, and there's no better, more surefire way of kind of messing around with contract language than having new things happen. And so, maybe 20 years from now, this will be settled and it won't be a question. But right now, nobody knows.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned how you like to argue that helped propel you into the legal field. I've got to believe, and I just listening to our conversation, I've got to believe that at some point this is going to go to a court of law somewhere. Somebody's going to have something declined, some sort of event declined.
It's going. It already has gone.
It already has. Okay.
Yeah, it has. I mean, it's been going on for a while. I mean, when I mentioned the including with the NotPetya, I mean that is being litigated. I don't know that there is certainly it hasn't made it to the Supreme Court. I don't even know if it's gone to any circuit courts of appeal. But it's coming. It's in process. We will know more over time, as is usually the case here. But we're still very much at the beginning of it.
Hey, listen, before I want to slide this in before we go to our next break, because I want to make sure you are a podcaster. You have a really great podcast, and it talks a lot about these issues. Speak on your podcast and why business owners should be tuning in.
Yeah, so the podcast is named the Cyber Risk Management Podcast, and what we discuss, unsurprisingly, is cyber risk management. And if you're a business in today's world, and you, frankly, if you have a computer or any data at all, which is, let's be honest, almost every possible business you can think of, then you should at least be aware of cyber risk. And if you're going to be aware of cyber risk, you might as well learn how to manage it. And that really is the focus of the podcast, is identifying cyber risk, assessing it, determining, how you can mitigate it or avoid the risk, and then learning how to recover, if you're attacked. That's really that's really the primary purpose.
And the name of the podcast again is, for people who are writing this down quickly,
the Cyber Risk Management Podcast.
There we go. And so with that, we're gonna fly into our next break. We're gonna take that short break to hear from our corporate sponsors. And when we come back with our guest, Jake Bernstein, for our famous Plead the Fifth section of the show, we're going to make a hard pivot to puppies. Don't walk away. We'll be right back with more of the Shrimp Tank.
Plead the Fifth is brought to you by our corporate sponsors: Ideal Life 360, Cornerstone Financial, First Underwriters Insurance, Kitsap Sun Newspaper, BC Fitness Studio, and Upstart Group. Please visit our website at www.shrimptankpodcast.com/Seattle to learn more about these terrific companies. Now, back to our show. Welcome back. We will
this is the part where, and I know this is why I love live stream. Welcome back to the Shrimp Tank, where we interview the best and brightest CEOs. I am not Barb Whedon, but our guest today is Jake Bernstein, and you're going to throw it to me, which I'm just going to take right away. I'm going to take the baton. We're going to go straight into Plead the Fifth. And what we're going to do, Jake, is we're going to, you're an attorney. You understand the whole
I know what Plead the Fifth is. Yes.
Yeah, but you only get to plead the fifth once. So, and that's up to you. You can't, you can only plead the fifth once. We'll see. I don't think you're a fair catcher. So I think we'll see how that goes. But we'll have some fun with it. Now, I told you I made a pivot to puppies. My understanding, and from our crack research staff, is that you have raised guide dogs for the blind. And so is that a correct statement before I jump into this?
That is a correct statement. I do not need to plead the fifth on this.
Oh, no. Well, okay, good. So here's the plead the fifth part of it. I want to make sure our information was accurate, because with an attorney, if it's inaccurate, I'm in trouble already. How hard is it to give up a puppy that you raised and send them off somewhere else? Because we have 2 dogs. I got to think that that's hard.
It's very hard. It's a lot like sending your kid off to college, except you're probably not going to see them again. So, yeah, it's and that's an easy question. It's difficult.
Well, I'm just curious. How did you get into doing that? How long have you done it? How old are the dogs before you have to transfer them? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, it's a great program, and I will say, in full disclosure, we haven't been a part of it now for a couple of years. Now, obviously, I don't know how difficult things became before with the pandemic, because
Sure.
The whole idea of being a puppy raiser for Guide Dogs for the Blind is that you take the dogs out, right? They're supposed to experience the world, and obviously that became quite difficult with the pandemic. So I'm sure that will cause issues. But the answer to your questions is, you get the puppy around 8 weeks old. You raise the puppy until about a year, 15 months or so, and they will go off to guide dog university, basically. And they're there for a few months, and then they either graduate, in which case they are assigned to a handler and a blind person who will then go forth and learn how to use the guide dog and all that stuff, or they will be career changed, which means that they are either potentially going to be a pet, or they oftentimes, you think about it, right? Being a guide dog for the blind is probably like the hardest single job for a dog. And there's a lot of jobs that you could do that are not as taxing. So like, emotional support dog, any kind of detection dogs, all that stuff can be a fallback career to over a guide dog. So there you go.
Did you see your dog again?
We have not. How old would he be? Well, probably because he graduated and went to Baltimore. So, because it turns out that even though Guide Dogs for the Blind is based in Oregon, it's a national organization, and so the dogs can graduate and go almost anywhere. So ours, Blazer, he graduated successfully, and he got paired with a woman who lived in Baltimore. So he's over there, and he's got to be 5 now, I would think, because he was our first puppy, our first guide dog puppy. And the reason we did it is that we quite honestly wanted to know what it would be like to have a dog in the family, and now we have our own dog. But yes, it was quite the experience.
You've been asked to address a group of high school seniors. What would you tell them?
Go into cybersecurity. If you want a job in the next 20 years,
Job security.
If you want job security, then look at security. I just think it's a major growth area. There's not nearly enough people to fill the jobs that are out there. It's not. I think I would tell them that it's not just a zeros. It's not a coder job, right? Let's be clear. It's not a coding job. It's a risk management kind of thinking type job, and I think it's probably it. I mean, I'm biased. I think it's the coolest thing that there is to do right now. But if you didn't think that, you might be surprised. That's what I would tell high school seniors.
Very cool. Well, Jake, we've been asking during this Plead the Fifth section the same question to all of our guests for about the first year or for last year, and we're compiling them. So I know you love cyber, but I'm going to pull you out of there. You got to start a business, and you got to start a business based on a hobby. What's the hobby and what's the business?
Let's see. I would say now I'm tempted to plead the fifth, but I won't. So I have an obsession with note taking and organizational and what they call personal knowledge management apps, to the point where it's almost a hobby. And I think that if I could go start a business, I would try to invent the perfect personal knowledge management, project management application. I would join a very crowded market. That might be true, but that's what I would do.
All right. That's the first one we've heard. Just so you know, Jake, that we've heard doubles on beekeepers, but this is the first one we've heard on that. So you're it's not as
sure yeah.
So it is said that we are our own worst critic. What is something that you struggle with?
Well, I believe I just mentioned project management. It's particularly in my role, there's a lot of information, a lot of requests, a lot of tasks coming in all the time. Managing that deluge of information is a challenge for anybody, and I think for me in particular, it's a constant struggle. And maybe that isn't unique, but it's certainly if there was something that I could just wish for, it would be to be able to perfectly remember everything that I have to do, so I don't miss any response deadlines or anything like that. It's just it's tough.
So, I think small and medium-sized business owners, especially the smaller ones, are really challenged with cyber and cyber liability because they don't have people on staff. You start getting into much larger organizations, Fortune 500 companies, all of that. They have people, right? Small business owners don't. What's the biggest mistake, or maybe the thing that's being overlooked the most by small business owners in regards to their computer systems, their networks, and their behaviors and activities with cyber?
That's easy. Assuming that their quote unquote IT guy has security handled. This is not a broad indictment of the IT practitioners. It is more a recognition that cybersecurity and IT are different functions. And if you make the assumption that your IT guy is also your security guy, you could be in for a very rude awakening. So that is one of the biggest blind spots / poor assumptions I see, particularly in the SMB space.
What book has been most influential in your life?
Oh man, you're just coming at me left and right with random questions.
That's what Plead the Fifth is all about. This is our own.
We gotta keep it, you know.
Yeah. You know, so the short answer is, I mean, I don't know. But the answer I'm gonna give right now is actually a book called The Bullet Journal Method by Ryder Carroll. You know, it's not a story, it's not a novel. It's a very you're gonna make fun of me now, but it goes back to the whole, like, how do I keep track of everything and what do I do? And it isn't like many books, you know, the question for project management and task management isn't like, how do I make a to-do list? It's actually really deeper than that. And it comes down to, what kind of life do I want to live? What makes me happy? We all have the same 24 hours a day. How are we going to spend those hours? And, do we want to spend them doing things we enjoy? Do we want them to just disappear as we fritter them away, not really being intentional about the way we use our time? Or do we want to be mindful? And if this sounds like, gosh, that sounds like a philosophy and spirituality book combined into, how to take notes. It is. And that's true with a lot of these kind of, even from, you think back to Franklin Covey's, famous, the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. It kind of starts there. It goes into David Allen's Getting Things Done. That's a very influential book for me. And the Bullet Journal Method arises out of both of those. So there you go. That's my answer.
Okay. Thank you so much for being a guest here on Shrimp Tank. For our listeners that want to get in touch with you or to learn more about your company, how would they go about getting more information?
Sure. I can be found on LinkedIn. I can be found at my firm website, K&L Gates, klgates.com. And you can look me up there.
Great. And your podcast.
And of course, the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Yes. Great.
Make sure to check out all the replays of the shrimptankpodcast.com/Seattle. And wherever you get your podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher. We also ask, please follow us on your social media pages, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.
And of course, just give us a 5, give us high ratings, tell us you love us, and we will all be happy. Jake, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Barb, thanks for coming out from behind the curtain. We'll have you back behind next week because Phil Simchich will be joining us. Everybody listen, if you like us on our Facebook page, you can live stream every Wednesday at noon. Our next show will be Wednesday, March 16th. Our guest will be one of my very good friends, Jed Selter. Jed is an author and thought leader. We're going to talk about his newest book. In the meantime, though, please be safe, be well, and be prosperous, especially be safe and well out in the cyber world, because until next week, the shrimp is back in the tank. So long.
I've been feeling like a shark in a shrimp tank. Big fish, small pond in the shrimp tank.